Today's talk is titled Joseph and the House of Israel, and we'll have a little bit of a look at the life of Joseph and the sons of Joseph. We'll also have an introduction into the book of Genesis and how it affects us even today. So let's get into it. Well, welcome to talk number 3. Today we're going to have a look at Joseph and the lost tribes, the house of Israel. Today's talk will concentrate on the history of the house of Israel, and we'll do a bit of a recap of biblical history up until the division of the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And in the next lesson, in the next talk, we'll look at the prophetic future which we are entering into for the house of Israel. But in this talk, we'll look at the history of the house of Israel. In this talk, we'll look at the fullness of the Gentiles, Bible prophecy and time. We'll have a look at an overview of the book of Genesis and Joseph, and the division of Israel into two houses, the house of Judah, or the Jews, and the house of Israel, or the lost tribes, who have lost their identity. And we'll look at the reasons for the dispersion of the house of Israel through apostasy, and of course Yahweh's scattering of the house of Israel, the 10 lost tribes. And we'll briefly touch on the prophesied regathering of the lost tribes, but we'll look at this in detail in talk 4. In Romans 11:25, the Apostle Paul tells us, "For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." So we know that Israel is going to be restored, or at the very least it's going to be have its sight restored. It's going to see the Mashiach. It's going to have its blindness removed. It could be that the Apostle Paul was alluding to more than meets the eye, because that very term, fullness of the Gentiles, is very similar to a term in the Hebrew in the Old Testament regarding Joseph's son Ephraim. And we read in Genesis 48:19 that his seed shall become a multitude of nations, in the King James Version, or literally fullness of the nations. Now let's have a look at that in more detail. And his father refused and said, "I know it, my son, I know it. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Howbeit his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations," literally fullness of nations. And so this is Jacob, the father, speaking of Ephraim to Joseph. So let's have a look at that verse in more detail. Here's the term in the Hebrew, Milei HaGoyim, and here is the term in the King James Version, multitude of nations. The Young's literal translation translates it fullness of the nations. If we have a look at the Hebrew word Melo HaGoyim, we find that Strong's Concordance says fullness, literally or figuratively, fullness, multitude, and so on and so forth. The Brown Driver Briggs definition is fullness. So the literal meaning of the verse in Genesis regarding Ephraim is speaking about fullness. He'll fill the Gentiles. How do you do that? Well, one way to fill the nations is to be scattered amongst them, which is exactly what happened to the house of Israel, the northern tribes, the 10 tribes. It's not the Jews. They are mostly from Judah and Benjamin and Levi, and perhaps a smattering of other tribes and other converts. That's the Jews. But there is another part to the nation of Israel, and they have lost their identity. So this fullness of the Gentiles may allude to Ephraim. When Paul's talking of the fullness of the Gentiles, he may be alluding to Ephraim, as well as real Gentiles. But there are still 9 other lost tribes of the house of Israel. Why is Ephraim so important? Well, because his tribe is far more numerous and has a leadership role for the lost tribes. We will look at the prophecies concerning the house of Israel in more detail later. And sadly, this is an area where many Christians and Jews also are ignorant, but especially Christians in the church. First of all, they hardly read the Old Testament often, and let alone the New Testament, but they do not understand how important the division of Israel into these 2 halves, the house of Israel and the house of Judah, are prophetically. And so this is what I hope to lay the groundwork with in this talk. There are many prophecies in the Old Testament regarding the restoration of Israel. And these prophecies include not just the Jews or the house of Judah, but also the lost tribes of the house of Israel. And this is one of the reasons that Yeshua came into the world 2,000 years ago. He said, "I'm not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now, most Christians just think the house of Israel, the Jews, is the same thing. Well, it is not. In most cases, when the Bible speaks of the house of Israel, they're talking of the 10 tribes. And when it says the house of Judah, it's talking of the Jews. That's where they get their name from Judah, Yehudi, Jews. And these 2 houses are separate until they're brought back together 3,000 years after they separated. So first let us look at the nature of biblical prophecy, and then we'll have a look at the past history of the house of Israel, and then we will have the understanding to begin to look at the prophetic future, which we'll look at in detail in the talk following.